The upward mobility myth, the one that paints America as a nation where everyone has an equal chance to surmount any obstacle and advance from rags to riches. It's an idea sown on our shores by a founding father, himself born into poverty, Benjamin Franklin.
He's the youngest of 10 sons, and his sister Jane is the youngest of 7 daughters. Benny and Jenny, they're called when they're little. Their father's a candle maker and a soap boiler.
Historian Jill Lepore, author of Book of Ages, The Life and Opinions of Jane Franklin, writes that Jenny and Benny are close. He teaches her to read.
They spend their childhood making soap and dipping candles. Benjamin is an apprentice to his brother, who's a printer. And when he's 16 or 17, he runs away to Philadelphia, and he eventually opens up his own printing shop. And he does so well that Franklin actually manufactures most of the paper in the colonies in the 18th century. He opens up and owns a whole lot of paper mills. Paper in the 18th century is made from rags. And so Franklin, in his newspaper, the Pennsylvania Gazette, prints these little notices: bring in your rags, cash for rags.
Ben sends them to his mill to be pulped.
Franklin, though, also gets the license in Pennsylvania to print paper currency. So Franklin literally turns rags to riches. And that's really where the notion comes from.
Thus enriched and, of course, esteemed for his service to the new nation, he recounts his rags to riches saga in a groundbreaking memoir.
The only sort of stories of lives at that point are the stories of the great, of kings and princes. And Franklin starts out as a pauper, essentially. So he publishes this autobiography to be a model for young men. He wants to tell the story of having made his own rise.
This is not to slight the man who helps draft the Declaration of Independence, invents the lightning rod, his stove, bifocals, the flexible catheter, and the glass harmonica you're hearing now, and who also launched the first lending library and also the first publicly supported hospital. Clearly, Ben does not want the poor struggling for books and medicine, but as a general principle, he's okay with struggle. He famously wrote, "The best way of doing good to the poor is not making them easy in poverty, but leading or driving them out of it," and that the less was done for them, the more they did for themselves.
He's responsible for himself and his great success and his success alone, and people in his life that depend on him or on whom he may have depended for support, he erases them. And that becomes so much a part of the literary tradition of American autobiography.
So it's like the original pick yourself up by your bootstrap story is like a Ben Franklin.
Yeah, but as we mentioned in the piece, one notable absence from Ben's book, his sister Jane, married off at 15 to a ne'er-do-well with a history of mental illness passed on to 2 of their sons. And when most of her 12 children died too young, Jane raises their children and their children's children.
Her whole life, she's constantly trying to scrabble together some kind of a living by taking in boarders, taking in laundry, making the family soap. But the fascinating thing in remembering how important that story is to our sense of the American past is Benjamin Franklin's sister endures the fate that almost everybody else in the 18th century does. She remains in the station to which she's born.
And she writes with love to Ben that some impediments are just too hard to break through, and that far too much potential is squandered through an accident of birth.
And that's the story of Jane Franklin's life. She's this brilliant woman struggling, to figure out how to get firewood for her many, 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 many children, taking care of Franklin's parents, whom he abandoned, who were sick and destitute in their old age. He comes to Boston and erects a giant monument to their memory that really just celebrates him and his generosity. The historical record is asymmetrical. We know so much more about the people who thrive and so little about the people who don't thrive. You really have to think hard. What is this story telling me? What is it not telling me? What is Franklin's autobiography telling me? What is it not telling me? Who's missing here?
Ever since, the self-made man has been the avatar of the American spirit, especially in politics, starting with old hickory Andrew Jackson right up to Hillary Clinton citing her drape-making dad and Donald Trump claiming he grew his fortune from nothing but a small multi-million-dollar loan from his father. Likewise, the 2004 election featured Dick Gephardt, son of a milk truck driver, John Edwards, son of a mill worker, and Barack Obama, son of a goat herder, leading Jon Stewart to ask Daily Show's senior political analyst Stephen Colbert,
"Are they laying this on a little thick? Does it ring hollow if everyone trumpets this bootstrap story?" Wow.
That's pretty cynical, John. I mean, I, for one, connected with what they were saying. Then again, I myself am from humble origins. My father was a poor Virginia turd miner.
I'm sorry?
He mined turds, John. That's why I believe in the promise of America, that I, the son of a turd miner, could one day leave those worthless hicks behind while still using their story to enhance my own credibility.
In terms of the American idea of upward mobility, the bootstraps myth, clearly it happens enough so that it persists. But what is the case you would make?
I even think it might happen enough to make it more likely to be in America than to be in the Philippines or in Argentina or in Mexico or...
Right. Like, is there some kind of analysis that says how many people born into a certain social place end up moving up? Like, what percentage of Americans throughout the course of their life actually do better?
Well, the way that you measure this generally is how many people go from the bottom of the fifth income bracket to the top. And for America, on the average, it's about 7.5%.
Wow. That's
not bad.
Which is...
Is it really? It sounds low to me.
Really?
Yeah. I would imagine I was hoping for a bigger
going
number.
from the bottom to the very top.
But it's twice that in Canada. It's twice that nearly in Denmark. It's better in Australia.
So we decided to look at the numbers, the hard numbers. Denmark is 11.7, so that's much better than America.
And then Canada is at 13.4, which is...
That is double, yeah.
Roughly double. Yeah.
You know, there's a bunch of countries all across Europe that do better than we do. So, you know, when it comes to this basic measure of upward mobility, not only are we not unique, we're sort of toward the bottom of the pile when measured against similar countries.
Wow.
Are you sure?
Yeah. And the crucial thing to remember is that even within the U.S., your chances of moving up varies incredibly from one place to another. There's a famous researcher named Roz Chetty at Stanford, and he showed that in some regions of the country, your chances of moving up are really good, the best in the world. Places like San Jose, San Francisco, Seattle, Salt Lake City.
I'm looking here, San Jose 12.9%, San Francisco 12.2%, DC 11%, Seattle 10.9%, Salt Lake 10.8%.
But when you get to Columbus,
4.9%,
Atlanta,
4.5%,
Milwaukee,
4.5%,
Charlotte,
4.4%.
in Memphis, it's closer to 3%.
Wait, just so I understand what we're talking about, this is the percentage of people who are able to sort of move on up.
Yeah.
So it sounds like the bootstraps myth is pretty much not there, except if you're like born in San Jose or a place like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that just shows that your likelihood of moving up is based on where you are even more than who you are. According to Roz Chetty, the worst performing neighborhoods are correlated with segregation, income inequality, single-parent families, poor schools, and lack of social cohesion. These neighborhoods are very often black and overlooked when officials set budget priorities. Chetty says that government can effectively begin to boost mobility by investing in and fixing those neighborhoods. Meanwhile, it can do a better job of moving families, especially with young kids, out of them.
25% of the gap in earnings between blacks and whites is driven simply by the fact that blacks tend to grow up in neighborhoods that are much worse on average than whites.
The government already spends more than $20 billion annually on housing vouchers calculated to enable poor families to rent in better areas, but they can take years, even decades, to get. And when they get them, most states allow landlords to refuse vouchers, and they often do. So these families wind up where they started, paying a savvy slumlord much more for much less, because there's no place else for them to go.
In 1863, the Negro was told that he was free as a result of the Emancipation Proclamation being signed by Abraham Lincoln. But he was not given any land to make that freedom meaningful.
Martin Luther King at the National Cathedral in Washington, 1968.
It was something like keeping a person in prison for a number of years and suddenly discovering that that person is not guilty of the crime for which he was convicted. And you just go up to him and say, now you're free. But you don't give him any bus fare to get to town. And the irony of it all is that at the same time that the nation failed to do anything for the black man, it was giving away millions of acres of land in the West and the Midwest, which meant that it was willing to undergird its white peasants from Europe with an economic floor. But not only did it give the land, it built land-grant colleges to teach them how to farm. It provided low interest rates so that they could mechanize their farms. And to this day, thousands of these very persons are receiving millions of dollars in federal subsidies every year not to farm. And these are so often the very people who tell Negroes that they must lift themselves by their own bootstraps. It's all right to tell a man to lift himself by his own bootstraps, but it is a cruel jest to say to a bootless man that he ought to lift himself by his own bootstraps.
In 2003, the National Bureau of Economic Research published a famous study in which researchers responded to help-wanted ads for clerical, administrative, and customer service jobs in the Chicago Tribune and the Boston Globe. They applied with names associated with whites, like Greg, or blacks, like Jamal, based on naming data for babies born in the late 70s. The white names produced 50% more callbacks. A white name yielded as many more callbacks as an extra 8 years of experience on a black resume. In another study based in New York, whites with criminal records got more callbacks than blacks with clean records. So much for bootstraps. E.B. White once wrote, "Luck is not something you can mention in the presence of self-made men." Indeed, surveys find that wealthy people are far more likely than poor ones to say hard work is what leads to success and to credit hard work, above all, for their happy lot in life. Of course, hard work and talent matter, but they offer no guarantee. As Robert Frank, professor of economics at Cornell University, observes in Success and Luck, Good Fortune and the Myth of Meritocracy. He says success may also hang on the month or location of your birth, not to mention the wealth you're born with. But when we compose our personal narratives, those things recede into the mist. As Frank found when confronted by Fox News host Stuart Varney.
Am I lucky or not?
Yes.
Who I am and where I am. I'm
yes,
lucky.
You are.
Lucky, okay.
And so am I.
That's outrageous. That is outrageous. What about the risk I took? Do you know what risk is involved in coming to America with absolutely nothing? Do you know what risk is involved in trying to work for a major American network with a British accent, a total foreigner? Do you know what risk is implied for this level of success?
I do.
Is it luck that you hold a tenured position?
Yes.
That's nonsense. I am insulted by what you said.
Well,
you are going against the American dream.
I'm not.
Look, if you come to America with nothing and you play by the rules, you work hard, you get discipline inside yourself,
right.
You marry and have children in that order, okay? You do all of those things. You play by the rules. You will make it in America, and luck has nothing to do with it.
That's not true, sir.
I got in my cab leaving the studio, and of course, only then did I think about all the fat pitches he had thrown my way that I'd completely failed even to swing at.
Frank, speaking sometime later at New York University.
He said he'd come to the USA with nothing. He had a degree from the London School of Economics. That's coming to the US with nothing. He had somehow overcome the handicap of working in America with a British accent. Americans love British accents. He said he took risks. Well, what's a risk? I looked it up. Merriam-Webster, risk is the possibility that something bad or unpleasant, such as an injury or loss, will happen. He took risks and he succeeded. Well, that means, by definition, that he was lucky. Full stop. But I didn't have the wit to point that out.
But what does it matter, pointing it out? Well, as Frank notes, several studies suggest that when we feel gratitude, we're more generous to strangers. When we're reminded of luck's importance, we are more likely to plow some of our own good fortune back into the common good. But we underplay luck because we can recall our own struggles far better than the fateful but fuzzy roll of chance, and because the very idea corrodes our faith and free will, but mostly because, like Benny Franklin, we're deeply invested in our own autobiographies. Take me. My parents went broke a couple of times once we had to put all our stuff out on the lawn to be auctioned. I went to college almost totally on aid. But I always knew I was going to college. Even on nights when supper was leftover Kentucky Fried Chicken I brought home from the job, I knew that this was temporary. So I can say, wow, I'm really self-made. But I know I'm not. Sure, I always kind of knew I was lucky. But not until working on this series did I really begin to understand what that meant. Hard work is real. But bootstraps are bunk, and social mobility a myth. Unless a nation chooses to build the infrastructure, the roads on which a person can move upward, you pretty much can't get there from here.